Hello and welcome to the Crate and Crowbar podcast. It's episode 323 and it is Thursday, the 14th of May as we're recording this. And tonight I am joined by Tom Francis.
Hello.
And special guest, Soren Johnson.
Hello. How's it going?
We're good. Well,
Yeah,
I'm good. So Soren is the developer of many storied strategy games, Civilization 3, Civilization 4, founded Mohawk Games a few years ago, since has made Off-World Trading Company, and is now just released into early access a new one called Old World. So we'll get into talking about that shortly. But Soren, thanks for joining us. You seem to have come a long way since Knockout Kings 2000.
Who knew from there this is where it would end up? Yeah, you dug into my early resume.
I mean, I'm a journalist, and I found this site called Wikipedia, and
yes.
I don't know, it's just so good.
Makes it very difficult, yeah.
I actually already knew that, so I want that to be clear. Hey, before we dig into your Old World, we really want to talk to you about that. I wanted to just surface some new gaming news. What done come out yesterday? Very interested to see the first video of Unreal Engine 5 running on a PS5. There's a whole lot of polygons going on over there.
And they specifically talked about the number of triangles.
Triangles, yeah.
And I don't know, when people talk about polygons, are they always talking about triangles, or because I think if you do a non-triangle polygon, ultimately a 3D engine is breaking it down to triangles at some point, right?
Yeah, it's always triangles. That's like the one thing I remember from graphics class. From 3D class.
Did any of this technical wizardry excite you, Soren?
I mean, it looked really nice. I can tell are aiming straight at the Tomb Raider development team, I guess. I don't know.
Yes.
And it looks cool. I really wouldn't know what to do with all those triangles. That sounds like when they talk about billions. I mean, we're a pretty small team, so I don't. Generally speaking, I don't think about that too much, especially because for the games we work on, we usually are pretty zoomed out, so it often comes down to legibility. Like at some point, it's just you hit diminishing returns if you try to make things look too detailed. And like for gaming in general, what I often wonder, like there's the, it looked really nice, right? Like there isn't, the character looked great. It wasn't. I think we're kind of past the uncanny valley issue of actually like what a human looks like on screen. Now it's more of a different type of uncanny valley issue of like, everything looks like the gameplay systems are going to have a hard time trying to compete with how realistic the world looks, right?
Yeah.
Because often games are still like a bunch of very simple integers and booleans, right? And that can get awkward, if it's like anything goes physics game, like sounds great, but it can lead to some issues.
Yeah, that struck me as well. As I wasn't excited by it. It looked great, but I didn't. Nothing in my brain was like, "Oh, what's the next generation games going to be like with this technology?" It was like, "Well, it's going to be the same games, but like even more fidelity." But fidelity was never the problem. That's not something that ever jerks me out of a game that I'm playing. I'm not playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey and thinking like, "Oh, I would be so much more immersed if this thing was slightly higher polygon or if there was no pop-in or whatever." I just forget about that stuff within like 10 minutes. And so this when I first play a game that looks like that, I'll be impressed for 10 minutes and then I'll forget about it. And the actual mark of how immersed I get long term is going to be based on gameplay systems and things that are frustrating me about how it controls and stuff like that.
I guess the thing that they seemed to be trying to get across was the idea that artists are going to have less of a load on them, because they are having to make very high poly. I mean, when you're modeling something, you're creating in ZBrush or whatever a very high polygon very highly detailed model, which then I have no personal experience with this, but I understand that a lot of artists then have to spend a long time optimizing, crunching down for actual use in a game, and the engine, and a lot of the detail there is about communicating that's the engine just does it all for you. And there were a few artist friends who were sort of quietly enthusiastic about that. I guess we'll see whether that's actually plays true once it's in artists' hands. But that seems a pretty cool thing, that it eases a bit of workflow issues up for artists.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about it was that the terms of their licensing have changed, so that it's now free to use Unreal, and you owe them no royalties until your game makes over $1 million, and then you owe them 5% of everything after that. And that has changed. The previous deal, it was already free to use until you make a certain amount of revenue, but the certain amount of revenue before was $3,000. So from 3,000 to 1 million.
Yeah.
And I feel like the 3,000 thing, that's so low that
Right.
that almost feels like it's not about encouraging you to use the engine. It's more like, well, honestly, if your game completely flopped, we're not going to hassle you with the bookkeeping of actually sending us the money. Like that's so insignificant. Just don't bother. Whereas this feels like an actual thing. Like, oh, you can make a successful game and pay us nothing, and we'll just make our money off the ones that really take off.
Yeah, that was really impressive. I also, that stuck out to me. I mean, $1 million is a pretty, it's a pretty good bar. It'll be interesting to see if, I assume that's kind of like, aimed directly at the people who would normally use Unity. So, I imagine that's got to be pretty appealing.
And that's pretty much,
it's an interesting...
that's probably like 80% of all indie games, probably 90, maybe 95% of all indie games would have an entirely free engine if they want it.
Are you using Unity, Soren?
We are using Unity. Yeah. We jumped on that somewhat early on in Offworld, and so now it's like we're kind of in the grooves, right? Like everything we do is like kind of built for that, and it seems to work fine. I mean, like we have headaches, but I kind of feel like any engine is going to have headaches, and I'm not super aware of like something that specifically would change things for us. But honestly, we're not in a you gotta get some context here. Like, I am absolutely not at a point where I'm evaluating engines, right? Like, that's like the last thing you want to do when you just released a game. So it's not something I've thought about. Like, the video came out, and there was like kind of a moment for me. I was like, this is all running on a PlayStation 5. And I was like, are PlayStation 5s out? Like, I didn't actually know. I didn't even remember that they're announced. I mean, it's hard when you're a developer because you forget what like is public and what's not. And actually, I don't even know. I guess they have announced it, right? But they are not actually out, right?
That's so good.
Yeah,
I was going to ask you, like, because obviously it came out. Oh, sorry, Tom. Do you want to? I was going to move on to Old World, but did you have another?
Yeah, we should. I was just going to say that the PlayStation 5 announcement has been weirdly gradual. It's been the sort of like, oh, it exists, but we're not saying what it's called. Well, it's called the thing you thought it was called. Well, here are some really deep technical details, but no real announcements.
Yeah.
And here's a picture of the controller, and it's just like weird drips and drabs that no one of them is particularly exciting.
Yeah. The I should say the thing that really excited us was the multiplayer stuff that they announced. Because Old World is on the Epic Store, and we used Steamworks for Offworld, which was a great solution at the time, but led to a lot of problems now, in the sense that like we've actually had to kind of like pull Steamworks out of Offworld so that we can move it to other stores, because that was kind of the devil's bargain you made with Steamworks, right? You got a huge leg up, but you're like very much shackled to Steam. And Epic is just apparently just saying, here's all our stuff and use it, and you can use it anywhere you want. And so we're going to be trying to transition over the stuff we're using right now for our multiplayer system. So it's actually coming at a pretty good time for us.
Yeah. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
We're not using the system at all, are we? We have a system for ensuring Alex and I don't speak at the same time when we're not using it. I wanted to just say, so Epic's like Steamworks equivalent is going to be free for anyone to use, even if they're not using Unreal and even if they're not on Epic Store. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just anyone can use it. Yeah, they're an interesting company because like we often, since we use Unity, and as we told people like, yeah, and we're going to be on Epic, we got a lot of questions of like, oh, really? They're okay with you because you guys are not using the Unreal Engine? But actually, it was actually a plus. They were actually really excited to work with us because they wanted to show people that like, yeah, Unity games should be on the Epic Store, right? Like they don't have any interest in like trying to make their store only for Unreal games, right? Like they wanted to make sure people saw like, here's this big Unity game and it's on their store and it's great and they're doing fine and it's no problem. But yeah, we're really, it'd be great to get all of the, because right now we're kind of trying to cobble together all of our multiplayer stuff through various different systems. Like we have some GameSpark stuff in there and we have some Unity stuff in there. And if there was just like one solution that was free and covered all that, that'd be great. I know my like my wife, my wife and I, we run the studio together, and she's been like bugging them incessantly about how she wants achievements in the game. And so she's finally like, all right, great. Now we can finally start actually doing this stuff. So yeah, I think our team is hoping that it works as good as it sounds.
Yeah. Do you want to pitch Old World to anyone who's not familiar with it?
Sure. All right. So Old World is it's in some ways a very traditional 4X turn-based strategy game, right? You build an empire up from a settler up to well, not globe spanning, but map spanning. Well, maybe both, spanning and spamming empire. And so you have a lot of the sort of the core tenets of what you see in a Civ game. But I think if you scratch deeper, you'll kind of see that almost every system is reworked in some very significant ways. Kind of one of the big ones is we have this order system that completely changes the way you move units. Traditionally in 4X games, you just move every unit every turn the way you would in, frankly, tons of games, even going to like war games, right? Like physical games, right? And it was just a very familiar setting, and we wanted to see what it'd be like if instead you said, hey, here are orders are a resource. These games are very much about resources. What if your actions were a resource, right? So you can use your orders to move units however you want to. So if you want to just spend all your orders moving just this one scout during your turn, you can do that. That's up to you. I'd say the other big thing that's worth mentioning is that this is a game that's actually at a human scale. So a game like Civ, has leaders, but they're very much kind of like these abstract, they're almost more like gods than people, right? Because they last for thousands of years and they never really change, and so on. And in our game, you start at if you're Greece, you start as Philip II, right? And you're a certain age and you're married to Olympias, and you have Alexander as like a 14-year-old. And you're going to get older, and eventually you're going to die, and Alexander is going to take over, right? And his life is might turn out one way or might turn out another way, or he might even die before you do, and someone else will take over. So we have this whole sort of like character / family / event system going on in the background that might be the real rough comparison, right? This is something like Crusader Kings. We were kind of trying to hybridize that into like a 4X setting.
Yeah, the thing that really shocked me when I played it was I think I knew that you were doing the order system. I knew that you had some Crusader Kings type elements of lineage and personal stuff going on. And I just assumed that between the lines that meant you were doing a much pared down, very simplistic version of Civ plus those two, interesting new additions. But then when I played it, I found it was like is almost a completely fully fledged Civ game. Like I played a lot of Civ, but I've only probably finished one game in my life of any Civ.
Right.
Which is to say I've played it for hundreds of hours.
Yes, of course, like everyone else.
I only finished the one time. And so I'm someone who kind of like wants to like the genre more than I do. But that means I'm not 100% au fait with every feature. So I can't actually tell what you've taken out of Civ. I can see what you've added. You added loads of cool stuff on top. But to me, it seems like you've made an entire Civilization game and then also added these things. Yeah. Have you simplified it?
Well, I don't know about simplified. It's simplified in the sense that I think one of the issues that Civ runs into is that the premise of the game is just inherently appealing. The fantasy of the game, the thing that sells it, right? All of human history, right? Like, there's a tendency for, consumers and for marketing where, more is always better, right? And it's hard to compete with that, right?
Yep.
But, from a practical point of view of what makes an enjoyable game experience, like that leads to a lot of problems, right? You can't just sort of like be like, okay, we're going to say we're about all of human history, but we're going to kind of blur things so like it goes fast enough. Like, at some point, you should sit down and say like, well, what's the actual experience we want the user to have, right? Like, how many hours should they be playing this game? How many turns should we play in this game? And at least in my work as a civ designer, like I kept hitting that boundary of like, if you try to shrink it down too much, people are like, well, where's the muskets, or where's this certain my favorite part of history, right? And makes it really difficult. So now I've actually lost track of the original question, but it was about complexity, right? So
what have you removed?
Yeah, so just that we're not shackled to this like enormous scope, I think is kind of freeing. Like you can, I hope you are able to finish a game of Old World, because it is kind of very much meant to be finished. Like it will take, it will take a lot of time. I mean, these are definitely like 10+ hour games, but they're meant to.
How do you end it? Just out of interest, like
sure.
What is the end point?
So there's two paths. This took a long time, like I could probably give a whole talk on just the victory conditions here, because there's just this very basic game design lesson here of like your eventual solution will always be like way simpler and dumber than the one you think it would have been.
Yes.
Like and it's always like, well, why couldn't I have just done the simple thing at the beginning, right? Like it would certainly be a lot easier to code, right? And sometimes actually,
design.
yeah, exactly. And sometimes it actually does work. Like I think it's to some sense, it's important to be a lazy programmer when you're a game designer, right? To prevent yourself from like overdoing it. But yeah, so we went through all sorts of very complicated systems where like you give points for we had sort of like the point salad approach at a certain period of time, and like you'd commit to different paths. And I'll tell you the one thing I didn't want. Like I do think that a lot of 4X games have like there's kind of like a standard way you do victories. There's like, oh, we're gonna have like 4 or 5 victory flavors, right? We're gonna have like a culture thing and a diplomacy thing and a conquest thing and like an expansion thing and a religion thing and blah blah blah, right? You're gonna have all these different things, and I don't really think that's a good idea. Because basically at that point you're first of all, what's the right way to put this? Okay, so a very negative experience is if you're playing a 4X game and you're doing merrily along and you're focusing on something, you're focusing on your scientific victory or whatever, right? And then just suddenly like bang out of nowhere, you kind of get this message like, hey, guess what? You just lost the game because Greece just won a religious victory, and you're like, what? And it's it's very likely that you were not heavily involved in whatever buckets they were trying to fill to get their victory. Right. And so it's kind of like, is there a purpose here? Like how is that a good experience? Right. Like I do remember a couple early on Civ 1 games where like I had a science race and it was close with the AI, and it was like, that was like an actual good experience. But that's like kind of like the last time I remember having a good experience in that regard. Right. And that's because we both had, there was basically one yardstick. I mean, I believe Civ 1, it was just like science and then, kind of the default, which is like conquest, which is, okay, yeah, if you do eliminate all the other civs, the game is going to end, because what else would it do, right? And so if you do have sort of one yardstick like that, that works, right? And so that's basically what we have. We have a victory point system, which was not intended at all for single player. It was just what we did for multiplayer. And it works great in multiplayer. It's just X number of, you get a point for every city. You get an extra point if it's a legendary city, which is like the highest culture level. And then you get a point for every wonder and holy site. And that's it. Right. And before the game begins, we kind of do some math to figure out like, well, what should the target be based off of how many city sites there are on the map, how many wonders there are in the game, how many players there are, because you want to kind of divide it up. The threshold should be higher if there's only 2 players in the game versus if there's like 10, right? 7, that's our maximum. But for a single player. So you do some math and you come up with some number, and then you see that number very early in the game, right? Where you're like, here's me. I have 4 victory points, and the the Romans have 7, right? But we need to get to 30. So I know I have some time. And then you see if like one of the AI starts getting closer to that number, you're like, okay, well now I should start paying attention to them and do something about them if they start pulling away.
Yeah.
And so that's okay, but I don't think that would have been sufficient. So we have a second victory condition, which is the ambition victory. And this is one I'm really excited about, and I think it's pretty good now, but like I'm going to put a lot of more effort into like improving the system. And this is kind of like a quest-based victory system where it's based off of, as you play the game, at various points you're able to choose different ambitions, right? And so ambitions might be, capture 3 Carthaginian cities, or build the pyramids, or research 6 technologies, or enact theocracy or something like that, right? Like, various things, and the game is going to pick them dynamically as they go, making each ambition a little more difficult than the last one. And also it feeds into the event system. So if you have 3 families and one of them is scientific and one of them is militaristic and one of them is cultural, they're going to ask for different types of ambitions that they want you to achieve based off of their bias. So every time through an ambition victory, it's going to be a different 10 sets of essentially quests. Right. And if you complete all 10, then you just win, period. Right. And it's just recognizing that you were a great civilization, or great empire, great nation, whatever you want to call it. Right. That's all it's recognizing. And you don't have to worry about, beating or destroying the AI. And most importantly, the AI does not have ambitions at all. The AI doesn't do events.
Right.
The AI doesn't do ambitions. So there's at no point will you be like, hey, guess what? The Greeks got their 10th ambition. Sorry, game's over. Right.
Yeah, that system was cool to play around with. I was surprised, because there is this universal victory point system. I saw that early on, and like, okay, in my game it's 26. Everyone's trying to get to 26, and I've got 4, and everyone else has 5. And then I was chasing it. I think before that point, I was already focusing on ambitions, because that was a really clear, easy objective to follow right up front. And I think the first one was pretty easy. And so I was kind of expecting that making progress on that would also get me victory points. But now that you explain it, I see why those are separate systems.
They have to be
the
kind
ambition
of
thing.
Sorry, they have to be kind of orthogonal, right? It's a little bit like you played King of Tokyo, right? Like, right.
Oh, the board game.
Like there's like 2 very different ways to win there. One is by like accumulating stars, which is like, basically success. And the other is like by dying, right? And it makes the game very interesting that there are, these 2 paths that are separate. They have some influence over each other, but there are different tracks, right?
Yeah. I think I liked about the ambition system was that because there's 3 options every time, I was often able to sort of lean into something I was going to do anyway. I just got to a point where I've got archer technology, and every archer costs 100 wood, and I didn't have lumber mill technology until just recently. And in fact, maybe I didn't even have it when I got offered the ambition. And so I knew, like, I just need loads of wood anyway. Like, I have to focus on this next because I need all these archers. And the ranged units seem really useful, so I wanted to go for loads of those. And then one of my possible ambitions was like harvest 800 lumber, and that seemed like a lot, but I thought, well, I'm going to need 800 lumber anyway to make 8 archers, so let's just go for that and focus on everything on it. And that was kind of cool. I am like, where I've ended up with that is I think I've got like 3 ambitions done, and I think you have to get 10 to win. But then on the victory point leaderboard, I'm pretty much top. I think there's one other civ that's ahead of me now, but only by 1 point. And so I'm kind of, that for me now is telling me, oh, just forget about ambitions. Don't worry about them at all, and just pick whatever.
Now, ambitions are worth legitimacy, which give you orders and make you families happy, and also do other various good things for you. So like ambitions are worth pursuing just in and of themselves. So for what it's worth.
I didn't get very far into my ambitions because I probably played a good, probably about 4 or 5 hours. So it was, coming along, I had 4 or 5 fizzies, everything was looking good. And then Romulus went crazy on me. He was very, very, he was acting incredibly, the story system in it, I really have been enjoying so far. The the way that the characters really come through in a way that kind of, in Civilization, everyone knows about Gandhi and so on and so on, the aggressive ones and the kind of, but in this one you get so much more context, and I was really surprised. I mean, I don't know very much about the history of Romulus, but he was unhinged from the very moment I met him, and I kind of spent several years placating him until he finally lost it, and then annihilated me. It just absolutely annihilated me, and that was the end of Nebuchadnezzar right there.
Oh man!
But I was wondering about sort of, we've talked about a lot of mechanics that are underrunning all this, but I actually found the experience of playing much more emotional in a really good way.
Yeah. Yeah, we're hearing that a lot. People are feeling like much more emotionally connected to the game. I mean, they feel like they have stakes in it. Like they help raise some of these kids who eventually become the heir and then become the ruler, and I mean, it's about people, right? Like I don't think people ever really connected to these sort of like immortal leaders the same way you would to someone who you remember as a baby, and then eventually you see them grow old and die, right? Like it's a very different experience.
Yeah, it's cool. Like you have a lot of attachment to your own heirs.
Right.
You're just informed you've given birth, and then you get to make a lot of decisions about how you bring them up, and their education is going to determine what their stats they have when you eventually play as them, which is cool. But something I hadn't thought about until I played is that the other factions are doing this too. Right. And a really clever thing you've done is that some of the story events ask you to pick sides between an enemy leader and their heir.
Right.
So,
yes.
or one of their, it's not as clear cut as that, because you don't even, at least I didn't know whether the child in question was their heir. I assumed it was. I just thought, oh, they've got a kid, so their kid will take over. So it might be in my long-term interest to do the thing that their kid wants me to do. Like they're having some disagreement and you're invited to chime in on it. And maybe I want to make the kid happy because by the time I need their help, the current ruler will be dead and the kid will take over. And I did that. And then eventually the ruler did die long before. I think it was Greece, and the ruler died long before I needed their help with anything. But then somebody else was the actual heir. I kind of forgot that people can have more than one child. Like, well, I won favor with some irrelevant royal.
Yeah,
because I did wonder that, because I had a similar situation, and I sheltered the heir who didn't want to be ruler. And I should have picked up on the subtext of the fact that he didn't want to be ruler. He'd fallen out with his parents. They're probably not going to make him ruler anymore, are they? And also, he's in my city. So,
yeah. So there's actually an event that can lead to. It just doesn't always happen, where you're able to basically put that person back on the throne of that country. And then, of course, you have this great ally. So, I mean, the neat thing about the event system is that it has a whole bunch of events, but they're not necessarily tightly coupled, right? So, like you might see the same event a couple times, but it might lead to a different experience, 3 or 4 different ways, right? Based off of how other things happen in the game that it can go to. And like we have a lot of some events are very much specifically so what you're talking about was the runaway prince or princess event, right? And we have events that trigger just off of that, right? But we have other events that trigger off of the different traits you can pick up, right? So a good example of that is the mourning trait. I don't know if you had any kids die, but that's one thing that can happen to you. So you have a kid die, you go into mourning, and then we have a bunch of events that happen to basically, do you have a leader? Is the leader in mourning? Okay, then this thing can happen, right? And what's really nice about that is 2 years from now, some other writer could, right now, we have a pretty small writing team. It's my wife is leading the writing, and then we have another writer who's also doing some, and so they're pretty closely tied into what each of the other one is doing, right? And but a couple of years from now, we're probably going to be hiring other writers to do stuff, right? And so they don't necessarily need to know about all these other events. All they need to do is be okay, mourning. Well, that sounds interesting. I'm going to write a bunch of events that can happen if the leader is in mourning, right? And so now you have this new set of story sequences happen that wouldn't have happened before.
Right. That's. I think Alex and I both went into mourning, and we were both slightly shocked by how brief it was. Because it would be like 2 turns later. You're fine now. But of course, a turn is a year, so it's not brief in real time. But it didn't last long for either of us.
Yeah.
I was curious though about the stories. There's a fine line. I mean, it feels sometimes like every developer I know is on some level trying to tackle procedural storytelling, and some combination of narrative and generated elements is just this endless holy grail that everyone's kind of chasing in different ways, and it's famously hard, and it's famously has a lot of casualties along the road. And 4X games are actually one of the few types of games that reliably generates story, something immediately be called story, that the player can tell at least. That is different each time and is interesting. When you do written story events that pop up on the screen and actually just tell you what happened in words, it seems to me there's kind of a spectrum maybe between, an event thing that pops up and says this ruler has died and their heir took over. That to me is an event, as opposed to like a narrative. Like it's a plot beat that will form part of my story, but that can happen in every game I ever play, and I'll never sort of read that and think, that's the same as last time. It will always be like, you're informing me of some mechanical thing that's occurred, and you can repeat that as many times as you like, and it'll never grow old. Whereas when you tell a story of like a prince running away from their ruler and they sought refuge with you, there's a certain kind of specificity to that in terms of how you tell that story and write it, that if that happens in every game I play, it might start to feel kind of stale. And I was just curious if that was a concern, and how you try to navigate it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a concern. I mean, we're trying to. I think we're going with the like quantity as a quality in all of its own sort of approach. Like we have over like 1,000 events right now.
Wow.
And we're we want to ship with at least a couple thousand, if not more. I know Leyla and Andrew are working really hard on like trying to crank out as many as they can, and like we want to get other ones in. It's the different, like, it's kind of why I was talking about the different kind of like the loose connections between them, right? Because for sure, eventually, I think, you're right. Like the Runaway Prince event, like, at some point you won't be reading the flavor text because you're like, I know what this is, right? But the question is the different choices you make based off of it could lead to all sorts of other things. So you're going to be thinking about like all the other events. Like if one of the options is like, well, this makes the the other leader disappointed in me or angry with me or something, then that means that it could lead to all these other specific things. So you're thinking of all the different connections, not necessarily like a set specific event. We're also, the other thing we're doing is, we have a nice analytic system where, we can download a spreadsheet that'll show, for the 1,000 events we have right now, how often are they being triggered? Like a couple of the events that you guys mentioned are ones we're actually like aware of right now, that ones that tend to come up a lot, right? And so we'll then, we're then going to make changes to be like, okay, these specific events here are too general, right? Like some of them are very specific. They're like, okay, if you have a leader who's a hero and their spouse is a schemer and the schemer has a child, then it might blah, 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 right? It'll be like, and then you'll have this really cool event that like, it's kind of like the Olympias, Alexander type situation where like she's like scheming to get him on the throne or something. So like that's really cool, but it's much more, it's just less likely to occur. Right. And we want to get to kind of that place where the events feel much more specific, and we aren't having any events that are like, oh, wow, this event here basically happens every time someone plays. So, we're going to use that to try to fix that. And then we also, the analysis system also lets us see like what options people choose, right? Because that's another whole side of it, right? Like even if it's just as big of a problem if we have a wide variety of events, so you very rarely see them twice, but when they come up, everyone's always choosing the same thing. That's another big problem.
Yeah. I was wondering also what kind of stories you and the team are looking to tell. Like, does every ruler have the same kind of themes of stories and the same balance of those themes of stories? So specific stories that relate to them, but which perform certain roles in terms of their relationships with other nations, internal politics, family feuds, that sort of thing. How on earth do you go on about um, designing these stories for a game where you need balanced, the sense of balance between each of the civilizations, and also they've got to work with all the other resource systems, because obviously this is still it's a 4X game, and you're collecting wood and gold and all these other things across your nation. How is that all how do they all dovetail together?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if I actually have a super great answer for that. Like, because our system is kind of very much embracing the chaos of, like, okay, we're going to write all these events that, have all of these different prerequisites where, like, any event you write can, you can you can add a whole bunch of subjects basically to them, and you can set all these requirements for the subjects, right? Like, you have to have a ruler, and you have a religion that's in your empire, but it's not your state religion, but one of the families follows it, and this family happens to be upset with you, and so on. And, like, I think that so that atomic piece right there, that event, like, kind of like makes sense and is cohesive, right? But is that part of some larger plan to tell some bigger story? Like, I think we're actually kind of stepping back from that, right? Like, our hope is, as long as, like, each event makes sense and is written well and is true to something, like this, it's, the sum is greater than the parts, right? Like, people will, and we're starting to see this some in the forums and the Discord, where people will tell these stories about what happened to their ruler, and it's a lot of stuff where we're like, I don't really, they're getting the sense of these characters that we haven't designed ourselves, right? And so that's my hope, right? Like, we're trying not to, like, hold on too tightly to, like, any specific narrative. And it can be a little scary, but, like, I think in the long run, like, that'll be really cool to see what happens.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of player who will love that stuff and is very happy to read their own story into to piece
Right.
the events together in their head and tell the story, and even insert, embellish parts of it to sort of make more sense.
Yep.
And those players are very it sounds kind of bad, but I want to say easy to please, because I sort of had some experience with this with Heat Signature, which is just very bare bones on the story side of things, of, like, who your character is and what their relationships are. We intentionally just did the bare minimum, just say you're trying to rescue your husband, and that's all you know about your husband, and that you get their name. And with enough of those, people do piece them together and thread them into a narrative, and they'll play into it. It's almost like improv, where they're willing to bring something to it themselves and work with it, and they enjoy what they get back. And I suspect, I don't really know for sure, but I think there's probably a class of player who won't do that, who are just like, oh no, if you're not going to tell me a story, I'm not willing to make it up myself.
Right.
And I won't, when these events come in a bare bones form, they don't move me, and it's not what I'm here for.
Yep.
And those players, I don't think there's anything to be done about that. I don't think you'll ever get them. Like, there's some fundamental difference there, and so I kind of think with generated versus written narrative, we don't really need the middle ground. I don't think the middle ground really serves anybody, because the people who want a human written narrative want a human written narrative, and you'll never trick them into thinking they're getting one when they're not.
Yeah.
And the people who don't need that are really happy already and enjoying this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I sort of look at it as three classes of people, which is somewhat similar to what you are, which is, there are people who just, they enjoy, whatever, they enjoy Uncharted, or maybe the other one I'm blanking on now, the zombie one is like a better example, right? But the
Last of Us?
Yes, The Last of Us, right? Like, that's what they want, right? And great, they're not going to get that from Old World, right? And then there's people who like the chaotic, like, bottom up narrative thing that you will get in Crusader Kings, right? And we think that's something we hope people will want to do. And then there's other people who just know that like, okay, they're putting flavor on these events, but like the events are really just a bunch of choices, right? And so we care about them too, right? Like we want the decisions you make in the events to be difficult, right? That's why I talked about the analytics some, right? Like, we really think that like the events should be significant and they should be able to, and this is a big thing. Like another thing I'm really interested in is replayability, right? Like one of the things I'm trying to fix with the way a lot of 4X games is they have this certain like momentum problem, something that the Civ community calls the eternal China syndrome, which is that once your Civ gets rolling in one direction in Civ, like it just keeps going that way, right? And like it's a battleship. It's not really the game. Halfway through the game, things are just not going to change, right? You've achieved internal cohesion, and it's just going to get better, right? Whereas events and leaders changing and also leaders changing of other civs, where that will change the diplomatic play field. Like all these things are ways where we can inject variety into the game as it happens, which is something I think that is generally speaking difficult to do in a 4X game that's not like at a human scale.
Yeah, with the events and story system I had, I put my leader as a general because you can. So for those who haven't played, you can attach your leader to either be a governor of a city and boost them in a kind of passive way, or you can attach them to a military unit and they'll boost that as well. And I obviously like the idea of just marching around the world with my actual leader. And normally in a game, I think like it would be game over if you lost your leader, right? So that would be the most precious unit. It's your king in chess. It's the absolute life or death one. But when you have heirs, and me as the player am not playing as this person exactly, I'm more playing as the lineage. You can afford to be a bit more reckless. And so I was like, sure, attach them to a military unit. If they die, I want to see what happens when they die, for one thing. And then I had a combat encounter. I was, defeating some, I think it was the Gauls, and I fell off my horse and shattered my knee.
Yep.
And one of the options in response to that event was to basically broadcast this to your entire civilization. Like I can pay quite a significant amount of money to tell everybody in our whole society that this happened, which boosts, I think it was the training stat, the kind of military experience thing. It's like, look, I've shattered my knee, but I'm going to tell every single person in my entire empire that this happened, and that's going to inspire them, I guess. At first I thought like, oh, this is kind of funny because me falling off my horse like an idiot and breaking my knee probably shouldn't give all my my whole military like a buff. But then I thought about it, and the stat is not like military strength, it's training. And so really they're just learning a lesson from me. Like, hey, don't fall off your horse like an idiot.
I heard you could fall off horses. Let's not do that anymore.
Breaking valuable new ground.
Yeah. The thing is that and you may remember that we used to have a different name, right? Like we were called 10 Crowns. And that was built around the idea of that you would have 10 lives, right? And like when they're over, the game was over, right? And like, unfortunately, that was a great fantasy. It was like easy to sell that. But the problem then is then you get very careful and concerned, and even if you know that like you have 5 lives left, like just the fact that like your leader can die is going to stress you out, and like we really want people just to embrace like the question of like, well, what could happen, right? Like someone brings you you get some mysterious package, right? Like, do you open it? Like, well, like we want people to like see where the story takes them and know that like, well, okay, if your king dies, you're gonna have some heirs, and like then the story just goes a different direction, and you can hopefully embrace that, whereas we had really a hard time making that work before, so
that's a shame. That is a great like one-line concept, as soon as you say that, it's exciting. But I think all the reasons it's exciting are the same reasons that it pollutes the player's decisions. Because even if 10 is absolutely plenty, even if like nobody is using all the 10 of their lives, and 6 is more than enough, even if you're playing recklessly, just knowing there's a limit is going to push the player to avoid any risk.
Yeah, game design is funny how that works because, like, I sort of gave that spiel to many people over the last 3 or 4 years, right? And like, a lot, people would basically nod along and they're like, "Oh, that sounds awesome. That sounds great," right? And like, I don't remember even one of them being like, "Hey, wait a minute." Like this isn't going to work. And I mean, I'm talking about like very good veteran game designers, right? And like so it's just one of these things. Like sometimes like what sounds good when you describe it is much different from like what works when you when you have to make it work.
Yeah.
And I guess you also want serendipity to happen, and often in games which are kind of generated like that, the players have to roll with punches with your ruler just dying out of nowhere, which is a good story beat. But you have to kind of, I guess, as a designer, you have to carve out, sort of sculpt a space for that to happen, so it isn't frustrating, so you can appreciate the story aspect of it and enjoy the challenge of the next ruler that comes in.
Did you ever think about calling it 1,000 crowns?
I really tried to make it work for a while. Like the 10 ambitions were originally called 10 crowns. Like I was like, okay, I got it, guys.
Right, yeah.
Like, we'll just call ambitions crowns, and it'll work right. And the team didn't like that at all. Leyla in particular was just like, Soren, you can't do this. I'm disallowing
Let it go.
And like she kind of led the revolt. They all sat me down in the conference room and said like, this has to end. We need to. And it actually was pretty late. I think it was March maybe where we made that call. March or February. It was definitely this year. So yeah, we called our trademark lawyer and like February. Yeah, I think it might have been February. And we called up our trademark lawyer and we're like, we're doing the thing that you probably don't want to hear. We need you to do some research. And surprisingly, I actually thought Old World might not be available as much as I thought it would. Because it's it's kind of hard to name games with names that are like kind of open ended, right? Like a lot of them frankly are taken. Like we wanted to call it Off-World Trading Company, we just wanted to call it Off-World, but there was some obscure mobile game called Off-World, so like we couldn't do it, right? And that was just that. The biggest one we ran into was just that, like, so apparently Amazon is coming out with this game called New World, and it was actually originally supposed to ship in May. And so when we changed to Old World, we're like, all right, well, we've got all sorts of problems with this name. Like we have another game called Off-World, and there's a game called New World coming out. And maybe we're approaching like Outer Wilds territory.
Yeah,
I don't know.
You could have gone to Old Wilds.
No, it's still out there if someone wants that one. So.
Older Wilds, if you want to go with the other one. Both Tom and I really enjoyed the order system, which you mentioned when you were giving us the elevator pitch.
Right.
I really enjoyed the way it gave me more to think about in the early game as well. The scouting phase,
right.
And I was interested in the way that because as you explore, you come across sources of resources like elephants and sorghum and wheat and gold and things. And you can harvest them with scouts, and they also replenish, which gave that early game, and then actually it made that early game exploration feeling persist for much longer than it does in most Civ games, which I really enjoyed. And that really seemed to mesh really nicely with the order system, which made me think about how many things I was able to do per turn. Are those two things linked together in your head as well?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it really changes the way that you approach a turn, right? Like one thing we get asked a lot is how many turns is the game, right? And we basically draw a finish line at like 200 turns. But we've been hearing of people who are winning games at turn like 110 or 120 or 130. I mean, we're hearing plenty of people are losing games too. I think a lot of people are not used to. It's a new system, and they're discovering that the AI can wipe you out if it decides to. Because I mean, we can go into the whole combat side. That's another question. But like I think a lot of people are used to winning games and Civ styles games defensively. But just like, I'm gonna get some good units, and I'm just gonna let the AI smash themselves against me, right? And you don't. you don't take any damage when you attack someone in Old World. Well, you take 1 point if you're a melee, but whatever. And so that really changes the feel of the game, right? But at any rate, people ask how many turns the game is, right? But the thing is, it's not really apples to apples, right? Like a turn in Old World is a lot more meaty than like a turn in like a Civ game or whatever. Because if you can only move your scout once in your turn, I mean, and you can only do one thing with each worker, and maybe not even, you're going to try to move somewhere, but it's going to take you 3 or 4 turns to get to the place that you want to build the mine or the farm or whatever. Like, every turn it's much more like stop motion, animation or something, right? Whereas, in Old World, really the question every turn is like, well, you've got a bunch of orders. What do you want to do? Right? Like it's, do you want to go explore? Do you want to go build? Like early on, especially if people start playing at the, the lower levels, it will kind of feel, I think, a little bit more like Civ, where you've got plenty of orders and you just, you kind of just move everybody how you like to. But, ideally people start moving up and begin to experience like the game is really interesting when you just do not have enough orders. And like, there's always just a few less orders than you need to do what you want to do.
Yeah, I was excited about this game on the basis of the order system, mostly because I wanted it to reduce the amount of work I do in a Civ game. I've
Right.
said this before, but the reason I have finished so few games of Civ is I get to this point where I have so many units and there's so much I have to do every turn to be efficient, and it's not interesting. Every move I'm making is boring. They're all just moving things towards where I know I want them to be. I'm not making any decisions. But I wasn't thinking that the order system was going to increase the amount of thinking I would do. Like once the limit of orders is actually less than the units you have, or less than the moving every unit every turn, it suddenly becomes not only do you have to decide which what units you're going to move and what units you aren't, but also you don't know always. Like you don't start a Civ turn with a plan in your head of everything you're going to do. And so because you don't I don't want to sit there and maths out how many orders I have and how much each thing I want to do is going to cost me. So instead I have to do things in priority order, because at any time there's a risk I'm just going to run out of orders because I'm not pre-calculating at all. And that's really interesting because it pushes you to every turn ask yourself, what is the most important thing I need to be getting on with? And it isn't this scout. I've got like 5 different scouts, and usually in a Civ game that's the first thing I do is I move them around and discover some new stuff. And it's sort of vaguely interesting, but really the information is not of any relevance to me because it's the other side of the world and nothing else can actually get there. And I was doing that for Old World for like the first 20 turns or something. And then I got to the point where I'm like, actually, I can't afford the orders on this. This is stupid. Like, I don't need this information. I need to really think about what I want to do here. And it's more important that I make sure first of all my military units are doing what they need to do. And then once those are all done and I've got some orders left, I probably want to think about what my workers are doing. And Old World still has the Civ thing of like, there's a button you can click to just do the next thing, like whatever, tell me what the next thing is and do it. And in Civ, that is completely streamlines the experience almost to a fault, where I'm just going to click that button and then do whatever I need to do, particularly because the individual decisions you're making from that point onwards are not that interesting. There's usually an obvious choice. That's part of what made Civ a bit of a drudge for me at times, is I'm just clicking that button, I'm making the decision itself is easy, the button itself is guiding me to the next decision. It's very slick, but it's not super interesting. And here that button exists, but I had to like break the habit of clicking it. Like I started out just next thing, and I realized, no, this is leading me down a bad path. I need to step back and like, I'm going to tab through all my units and see which ones I need to move first and work with that.
Yeah, and it's kind of a challenge for us because we're kind of like out on a ledge, not a ledge, but like, we've kind of like jumped off the cliff and sort of like abandoning the interface that worked, right? Like the Civ 5 was really the one I think they took a huge step forward of like helping people streamline themselves through the experience. But the thing is, like, it's baked into the system at that point that like it's that type of game, right? Like there's no downside to just leading someone by the nose from unit to unit to unit, right? And for sure, like once I got the order system in, it was like this big realization for me that like, wow, like a lot of your worker choices, the reason why, we let people automate stuff is because the worker choices in Civ are just like, there's no reason not to use a worker, right? So it's not a choice, right? Like, and you're making these very small determinations of like, well, it should be a farm or it should be a mine. I mean, okay, I guess, that's interesting, but there's no question that you're going to do something with the worker, right? And that's definitely not true with old world, especially when the wars heat up. So we have elements of the UI that has worked for Civ, but like we're going to try to figure out ways to make it easier for people to figure out how to prioritize. Like we're going to in one of our coming updates, we're going to like split the button that lets you cycle through workers and scouts, so it's like just workers and just scouts, like two separate things. And there's also a way to like basically, there's like kind of like 4 or 5 different things that allow you to cycle through them. We're going to allow you to like basically move those around. So if you're like, okay, I always want to do my military first, you can move those forward, right? And if I want my scouts at the end, you move those back, right? And you can change it from turn to turn depending on where you are in the game, right? So we're going to have to figure out this stuff, right? Whereas like Civ has had 25 years, 30 years. Jeez, I don't even know.
God.
It's been a long time of like figuring out what's the right UI for that system. But yeah, this is a very different system.
I thought the order system, I enjoyed the sort of thematic aspect of it because it seemed to, mirror the, just how much an administration could possibly deal with,
Right.
in a year, I really enjoyed that. But like, I not all of the game is totally thematic. There's sort of some abstract stuff as well. There's the technology side is sort of reasonably abstract in the sense that you don't get the technologies are all based on trees, but the choices you have at any point are not all of the choices that the tree could possibly give you.
Yeah.
What was behind that decision?
Yeah, so I should give just the basic system is, it has the technology tree behind it that everyone's familiar with. But like the actual way the texts are presented to you are basically more like a deck building game. In that, when the game begins, it's like, okay, these are the texts you can research. We're going to put them all in a deck and you're going to flip over 3 of them, right? And you're going to choose one. And the ones you don't choose, you're going to throw in the discard pile, right? And also every time you research a tech, the text that it leads to, you also throw in the discard pile, right? And you keep drawing from your deck every time you're going to choose a tech until, of course, the deck is empty, and then you take the discard pile and you shuffle it and you start over again, right? And so what that means is each time through the deck, every tech that comes up, you're only going to get 1 shot at it, right? So if like 2 techs you really, really want, like sovereignty and lumber mill forestry come up at the same time, like you're making that choice knowing that you're not going to be able to get that other option for a while, right? And I can't say this is one of these things where I didn't really even bother to build a thematic wrapper for that. I just felt like from experience, it was just going to lead to a better game, right? It's going to add more variety because there isn't going to be a set way through the tree. It's going to lead to these tough decisions where, if you're choosing between these 2 techs you want, that, well, I'm going to choose this one, but then I'm just going to choose the next one the next time, right? It's not a tough decision, right? Because you're giving up less. And then it also opened up these other kind of weird ideas, like the bonus cards that come up, which are like, hey, you get a free archer, or you get a settler, or you get a bunch of orders, or you get some food, right? And those only come up once. They basically get trashed if you don't use them, which is something that, I guess we could maybe make it work with the other system, but it seems like it was a very natural fit for the deck. So that's probably the most pure, like, abstract, game design thing we have in there. But, the reason why I did it is like, I've got experience from Civ 3 and Civ 4. Like, I know that like there's pretty much a couple established ways through the tech tree, and that's it, right? And, I kind of wanted to break that. Like Stellaris does something similar. I had already kind of like was heading down this path, but like, they had kind of like a similar concept.
Yeah.
Huh. I did not know that's how it worked at all. I got that there was some kind of random element, like it was random what things I was offered, but I didn't realize that not choosing something would delay it by more than, I figured I'd still be able to choose the things I didn't choose next time.
We're working on a new UI for that system, like where it'll actually show you the shuffling, and like, you mouse over it and be like, here's the discard pile, here's the other pile, like, and so hopefully it'll be easier to read going forward. Although this does kind of like bring up something I also think is like something I like to do a lot, which is like I like to have optional complexity, right? Like, if there's this whole system underlying it, but at the end of the day, like you really don't necessarily have to understand it, right? Like if you just accept that, like, okay, I guess I don't get every tech each time. I'm still going to, choose one of these 4 techs, and that'll be fine, and I'll just move forward. And then maybe someday I'll actually go to the effort of figuring out what's going on here.
Yeah, I think the part that probably does need to be clear to everyone is that the passing up a choice is going to delay it by a lot, because I was sometimes picking a tech because it's like, well, this is going to be ready in 2 turns, so I'll just get the long one,
Right.
when this is done. And actually, that's a really bad strategy with this system. I should, like, the long tech, if that's the most valuable thing, I should definitely go for it, because if it's going to be discarded, who knows how long it is before I get a chance to research it again.
Yep. Yeah. It's, and there's some big downsides here also, in the sense of like, I've seen from streams just over and over again, like people get the you get your choices, right? And you have 3 or 4 choices. And the first thing a lot of people do is like, well, hit the tech tree button, right? And the tech tree pops up and they're like, well, I want to click, you can't just click on a tech to research the tech tree, because that's not the right system, right? And because it might not be the one that's currently in your hand. And, that's a pretty big loss, right? Like that definitely is adding some complexity to the game that doesn't necessarily have to be there, right? Like that's kind of like the choice you always have to make, is the complexity you're adding to the game worth the other positives that it brings, right? And I'm hoping we can kind of like fix that with better UI, but it's definitely something I'm conscious of.
I was curious, did you ever try, so the order system is basically like there's a central pool of moves, and then you're going to distribute those out to units. But in practical terms, there's another kind of factor to it, which is that each unit has a fatigue limit. And once you hit that, it becomes very expensive to order them around. And so in the early game, at least, it's pretty logical when you have few units they're all going to do all of their moves, and no one's going to do more than their fatigue limit.
Right.
I was curious, did you ever try the pure order system where it's only a central resource and you can use it as much as you like?
Yeah, that was the original system. And there's a part of me that is always going to be like, that was the best version of this game. Like, at some point I might even like, I don't know. The thing is, like, once fatigue became a thing, then it was like, oh great, now I've got a new gameplay thing, right? So like the Romans get an extra fatigue, and like there's like a general trait that gives you an extra fatigue, right? And I think if you're like if you're blinded or suffer, well, if you're blinded, you can't be a general, but if you're some other malady, you get less fatigue, right? So you start turning all the other knobs, so it becomes kind of like it gets like fully integrated, so you can't really pull it out anymore, right? Like I think that's where we're at currently with fatigue. But yeah, I actually really prefer that version of the game. But it had some pretty big drawbacks. We had a number of players who just had this very visceral reaction to the sense that like units could just come out of anywhere. So you could like grab one unit and spend 20 orders and move it all the way to the other end of the map, right? I think from a pure like game mechanic point of view, that leads to has the most variability. It has the most tactical. Has the most tactical options. It's like Go, right? Like the space is just enormous, right? And so that's a plus, I guess. But I think where we were is we already had such variance that there were a hybrid system had some other advantages, right? And one is that just simply like it does kind of help move you through your turn. The sense of like I don't just accidentally just spend all my orders on this one guy, right? Like we found that was definitely a problem where people would just they would just scout forever, right? And then there's other things, like it makes training interesting because like, oh, that's the resource you use to unlock the the marching, and it's then just double. And we had like a harsher system at one point. Like at some point some of our players maybe try a system where like there was no, like you hit the limit and like that was it. And I hated that system, like in the sense that you can't march, you can't go past your fatigue limit, because it's just so punishing if you just end up like one move short, right? Of whatever it is you want to do. And like, I very much wanted it to be like in the player's hands to do whatever they want to. They don't have to sit down and do the math of like, okay, can all 5 of these units go to the places I want them to get to this turn, right? So, you know, the system is kind of like this hybrid, right? And, you know, the question is simply like, okay, so that's some extra complexity. Is it, you know, does it all balance out? And, you know, I think it probably does. You know, like, I'm still a little sad. I really did like the anything goes system. But, you know, it works pretty well. It also I think works thematically, right? Just the idea that like you can only move a unit so far, you know, every year, right? You know, like I very much try to, like, as much as possible, you know, use the term year instead of turns everywhere I can in the UI. I feel like that really helps like make the game feel very, very human and very like concrete, right? Which makes these type of concepts more natural. I also should ask: Have you guys been using the undo button?
No, what? I didn't know there's an undo button.
Oh, jeez. Yeah. All right. Well.
And
all right.
Tom is Mr. Undo as well.
Like, yeah, I love undo
there's
buttons. Almost everything I do is a mistake.
All right, so this is it's a dangerous thing. Who knows? Maybe this could possibly ruin your experience, but we shall see. There is actually an option to like disable it because, of course, it is essentially like infinite cheating if you want to. But since the combat system is deterministic, that means it's not that big of a deal, right? But yes, so actually, every time I go on a stream, there's like basically like 2 things I ask people right away, which is, have you discovered infinite tooltips and have you discovered undo? Right. And it's kind of fun to see their reactions to that. Have you discovered the infinite tooltips?
Yes. I have, but only because you told me about it at a dinner a few years ago. Because we were talking about John Schaefer's At the Gates, and I can't remember which of us mentioned it first, but he has this tool system where you can not only can you mouse over a interesting word, a keyword in a certain description and get a tooltip for that, but if that tooltip also mentions a keyword, you can mouse over that as well, and then it's tooltips all the way down. Yep, absolutely. Yes, so your example is maybe not so typical, but you know, we have to kind of like encourage people to like we got a lot of complaints early on because, you know, people felt I have a hard time not calling it the Civilopedia, but the help thing is not as like friendly as they're used to, and that's because, you know, we're going to get to that. It's not our top priority right now, but I think the real thing is like we're really leaning as hard into the infinite tooltips as much as we can. So like you see some proper noun, you know, use the system, like mouse over it, figure out what that is, right? And yeah, I mean, it's you know, John came up with a cool system. I really believe that it will be the standard for strategy games. I'm actually surprised more people haven't, you know, copied it at this point.
I really like it.
Yeah, it's cool. But yeah, the undo button, you know, just kind of like, you know, something we tried out. I mean, obviously it has, you know, we've seen it more and more frequently, right? Like Invisible Ink had it, right? I seem to remember. And Into the Breach has it. Did Invisible Ink have undo? Yeah.
Walk permission.
Right. I'm not just right. And they treated it very much as a resource, and eventually, you know, when we put it in, there really was no reason to make it limited because we put it in so early into development. We're just like, okay, great, you know, throw it in, fine. And we just discovered like it just, you know, and, you know, obviously this is also only a single player thing. I don't know what type of hell would be with multiplayer with undo, but, you know, that would be problematic. But yeah, we just kind of threw it in just to see what would happen. And we just found out that like it really melds well with the order system because like, and you actually, I was going to bring this up earlier, I think, because I think Tom you were talking about how like it's, you know, when your turn begins, it's kind of hard for you to figure out like, well, what can I accomplish this turn, right? And so if you you know, you do this complicated military maneuver and you discover you're a couple moves short, well, if you want to, you can just undo back to the beginning of your turn and maybe do it a little differently, or, you know, don't move that scout you were going to move at the beginning of the turn, right? And it's kind of weird. I mean, like this is not how you're supposed to play strategy games. I don't know. Somehow it just kind of works. I mean, it does require, I think, a little bit of, you know, it's an optional feature, right? Like, I don't know what to say. It's just kind of it's just this weird thing, and it seems to work well in our games. People like it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm excited to try this now. That's how I want everything to work. I'm just like, I play Slay the Spire a lot, and that doesn't have an undo button.
Oh man, I have thoughts about that. Yeah,
you can. I'd like to hear them in a sec.
Okay.
But so that doesn't have an undo button, but you can just quit the game and go back into it, and then you're back at the start of the same fight. And I do that just constantly. Every run, I do that at least twice, because I will just play things in the wrong order. I'll just play it, and then it's not that the game tells me something that I didn't know. It's I play it, and then a second after I play it, I realize, oh god, I should have played this other thing first. And that kind of failure is not fun for me, and I don't care about getting better at that. Because getting better at that means just really obsessing over every move and sitting there and agonizing about, is this the right order though? Is there some other way? Or should I consider this? Should I consider that? Should I consider that? That is the mental state that plagues me in my real life. And I'm forever overthinking real decisions. In games, I just want to be able to forget about it, just try stuff. And if it turns out to be the wrong thing for some reason that I should have known, that I should have remembered, I just rewind and just remember it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you basically to describe my thoughts as well. But like, while I was, while I was playing Old World and being used to this concept of like I can experiment however I want to, and I don't need to stress over the order things. And at the same time, I was trying out Slay the Spire, and like having this system where it's just screaming for undo because it's deterministic, right? Like, and so like. And it's not even necessarily a very interesting decision. Usually it's like totally obvious which card you should play first. It's just that sometimes you don't figure that out until you kind of like actually go through the system, right? So there's like no reason not to allow the player to do that. And you want the game to be snappy. You want like every turn, you're like, okay, this card, this card, this card, this card, this card, right? Like it's not really a good experience if you play it kind of like if you need to like treat it like Into the Breach where you're like, okay, I need to like really sit down and like graph this all out. It's like that's not how you want Slay the Spire to play out. So that if they're listening, like I would strongly recommend that you guys give this a go. Like people will love it.
So Slay the Spire does actually have some random stuff in it. Like you have attacks that will hit 3 random enemies in random.
That's true.
Order.
Yeah.
But
so I remember
you can still get around it by having that be like a keyword on the card that says something like irreversible. And as soon as if it says that on the card, it means after you play it, you can't undo anymore.
Yeah. I would argue that they'd be better off, like if it's like 5 or 10% of the design, they'd be better off throwing all those cards away to get the ability to undo.
Yeah, I agree personally.
Yeah. Like sometimes you have to think in those terms, right? Like, oh, here's this amazing design idea. Oh, this sounds so much fun. But it closes this other door to me that's more important.
Yeah, that's my whole world with Tactical Breach Wizards but it's very closely based on XCOM, but XCOM is pure chance, or not pure chance, but it's full of chance. Everything is a chance. And every time I'm tempted to take any part of it, it's like, well, that undermines our entire like rewindability and all this
I
other
can
stuff.
imagine. I could totally imagine that. Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier about combat, where in Old World, unlike Civ, when you attack someone, you don't take damage. Is that right?
Right. I mean, like the melee units take like 1 point of damage, 1 out of like their 20 hit points. Basically attrition, I'd say, is more accurate. But yeah.
I was just curious, what was the thinking behind that? Why did you make that decision?
So initially we actually, it's kind of weird because we're shipping a single player game where multiplayer will be coming later. But initially, like the first year or so, we were only playing the game as multiplayer game. And it was kind of like, it just worked really well in multiplayer because, like in traditional, I guess, Civ style combat, it's like you kind of get two units jump into each other and you get a bunch of stuff happening and one of them dies, right? And that's a pretty dramatic outcome, right? And with the order system, you can get combat isn't going to happen like slowly, like whereas in Civ, like if someone is invading you, it's going to be this what's the right metaphor? I don't know, just this very slow thing, like slow forest fire that's just like getting a little bit closer and closer and closer, right? In Old World, stuff can happen very quickly, and in general, like the multiplayer games have much fewer turns. It's really fun as a multiplayer game, and kind of for that reason, like it's very dynamic. But it meant that like you kind of needed essentially to split the combat across multiple turns, right? So really the way to think about it is I hit you on my turn, and then on your turn, you hit me back, or you can retreat, right? Like that's the combat, right? And so the idea was like you shouldn't ever, if two units are like equally, have equal strength, it basically takes 4 turns to like for one of them to kill the other one. Now, normally there'll be multiple units attacking. There's lots of different ways you can boost up your units. So like maybe it means 2 turns, but it means you get this concept of like, okay, they move in, they strike, now this unit's on cooldown, and the other side gets a chance to strike back if they want to, right? So it's a way of kind of like giving some agency to both sides. And I don't know, there's a little bit that's just not even rational. It just kind of felt good from how we experienced it.
Yeah. So we have some questions from listeners, mostly focused on Old World and New. And actually, we have a new question that just came in during this podcast from your wife, who asks, ask Soren about religion.
Yes. So it's kind of weird because religion's been in there for the very beginning. She's smiling right now. On the spot. Religion's been there very early. I just kind of like imported a lot of just systems straight from Civ 4 early on when I was developing the game, and for the most part, all of them have been morphed into something completely different at this point. But religion still kind of works kind of similar to the way it does in Civ 4. There kind of some stuff that's a little bit unique about it, like that there's the theology system of like you kind of like upgrade your religions down certain paths. But the thing that's kind of unique about it, and I'm having a hard time making this come across necessarily in the gameplay, is these are global upgrades. Like if you and someone else are both Jewish, like if they choose that this is going to be a mythological religion, well, that then affects you as well, right? So it's whoever decides to kind of like commit to certain theology affects it globally, right? But what she's trying to get at is I haven't fully fleshed out religion probably where it needs to be. And my hope is that it's something that should be a major focus of like the event system and the narrative. And like, recently I had like families will adopt specific religions, and barbarians can also convert to various religions, or the tribes, excuse me. We have like generic barbarians, but then we have the named tribes on the map. And so like, to me, I think it could be a very interesting tool for diplomacy, especially like if you have 2 families within your nation that kind of believe in different faiths, right? Like that's, obviously there could be a lot of neat events that come from that. So it's kind of a secondary thing in the sense that like, it's just a nice dial that we can build other stuff around. But I don't know if I've necessarily come up with, some like amazing new concept. Whereas, you ask me about most other aspects of the game, I could be like, oh, I'm very excited about the resources in the market, or the orders, or the tech deck, or whatever. Right. So
this might be like a really dumb question, but what role do religions play in a game like this, a 4X game like this? Obviously, they're important to history, so thematically, that's an important aspect. But are they doing anything else?
I mean, do you mean like from a pure metal,
pure game
design point of view? So
yeah,
my initial inspiration for like putting religions in Civ 4 was like I wanted to kind of like borrow some of like the ideological conflict you saw in Alpha Centauri. In that you had some factions that were naturally opposed to each other, and I thought that was great. I could imagine even just adopting that wholesale like in Civ 4, but I didn't necessarily feel like the civs should be so stamped with like, well, this is the military civ, and this is the diplomatic civ, and this is the science civ, or whatever. I didn't want to be like completely overboard with it. So instead I kind of felt like, and also like I wanted things to be a little more dynamic. So that's kind of where religion came in basically. And that like it was important so that different blocks would form. And so like, oh, okay, like the Christian civs might, have good relations with each other, and then they might all be upset with the Buddhist civs or whatever, and that'll be different based off the personalities of the leaders. But basically, I needed some sort of like thematic reason why two civs might dislike each other. Because outside of that, what you're left with is just like, well, the civs that are close to each other don't like each other, and the ones that are far apart are okay with each other, right? And like that's okay, but like you really need some extra vectors.
Yeah. We have a question from Zed Fang, who writes, what's Soren's favorite game that's nothing like a game he makes?
That's a good question. What game do I play that's nothing like a game I make? Our family has been playing Raft a lot recently. It's been a good game for we have 3 kids, and like it's a good way to do something together that like is teamwork, sharing space. Can't really go outside too much. We also we love your something like Mario Kart is also something we love to play a lot. So I'm looking to play games with. I always enjoy being able to play games with people. I wouldn't say I actually play a lot of single player games if I can find a good multiplayer game. As for something that's like completely different, I can't really list board games because most of my board games are like most of my games are kind of described very much as board gamey, but yeah. I always blank on these questions. I love Sands of Time, which is like completely unlike anything.
Oh yeah,
I always think that game's just brilliant. There's just this feel to it, and this like what I really like about that, and maybe this is the element that appealed to me about that game, is I really like my games to be open to the players. Right, I like them to be very friendly to the players. I think it's fitting, like having like an undo system like fits very much into that. Where I very much just feel like okay, I'm gonna make this an interesting game, but I want to give you all sorts of different ways to play it and ways into it, and it's kind of open-hearted, right? Like it's accepting the context of the game, the reality of the world, the world outside of the game. That like what, if you want to save scum, like it's right there, it's literally right in your computer, right? Like that's there, and like I'm not gonna doubt you on that. And like what was really cool about Sense of Time is they just they were like, okay, this is a difficult game, people are going to die a lot, they're going to have to reload a lot. Well, let's just skip the reload step and just make that part of like the actual game itself, right? So like putting the rewind system just right there, it just totally changed the feel of those type of games, which are games like I always kind of like I'll enjoy like the first quarter of it, and then at some point it just gets so difficult that it's just like I don't like keep having to go back to checkpoints and whatnot. It's just like that's not what I'm playing the game. I don't want to beat there's 3 challenges in a row, which now I've totally mastered, and is just boring to me, to get to the hard challenge, which I'm going to fail, and I'm going to have to repeat through that. Like it's just It's wonderful to play a game where they're like, okay, this is the actual way someone plays the game. How can we make that as good as possible? And I hope I can be a designer that approaches games like that.
Yeah. Rob writes, dearest crates, crowbars, and industrialists of Mars. So glad that the pod and Soren can make this happen. I keenly anticipate your combined wisdom and puns. What's the worst AI coding decision you've ever made? Warmest, best, turn one, freshest regards, Rob.
Yeah, worst AI decision I ever made. So probably that goes back to Civ 3. I think when I was writing the Civ 3 AI, I didn't really understand that that an AI especially in a 4X game, it's not meant to replace a human. It's really, and hopefully you can see this some in Old World, where I'm really embracing like asymmetry. Like when you start the game, like depending on what difficult level you play on, like there's already these established empires, and you're like the new kid on the block, basically. And that the AI is not playing the same game as you are. They're more like NPCs, really. They're NPCs that might be able to wipe you out, but they're still kind of like NPCs. And so with Civ 3, I still was like, I assumed it was like, okay, basically the AI in Civ 3 is supposed to be like, imagine it's multiplayer, except the AI is, filling the role of the other humans, right? And so if something was available to the human, then the AI should take advantage of it too. So, like one thing that a human does a lot in a Civ game is contact everyone as much as they can to try to trade technologies quickly, as much as they can to like, move through the tech tree as fast as possible without actually having to research stuff, right? So if you are the first person to discover, the alphabet, then you should definitely contact all of your neighbors and see if you can trade the alphabet for ironworking from Persia and the alphabet for theology from Greece and the alphabet for something else from Rome, right? Like, I mean, it's just a very strong move, and which begs, which leads to another question of like, probably we shouldn't have that type of tech trading in a Civ game, but it was still like, it was the assumption that was okay at the time, and because of that, I was like, well, I'll just make sure the AI does the same thing because it's the right move, right? And from the human's point of view, what happened then is if you have the AI aggressively contacting each other all the time and being very, so we say loose with their trading parameters, because the other issue with tech trading is that you're not really giving something up, right? You aren't giving away your tech, you're just sharing it, right? So you lose nothing and you get something. That's why it's so lopsided. And so from the human's perspective, all they saw is all of the AIs tended to be at the exact same tech level, right? So it basically felt like you're playing against this cartel of AIs that were like, basically calling each other up all the time, swapping all their secrets, and you either had to get into the game or you'd be left out, and people hated it. Like it was just a very bad experience, and because it's about ultimately it's about the player's experience, right? Like it's not about like, am I designing the AI to perform as best as possible at the game? Yeah, same thing happened. You can see the same thing in Offworld, right? Where like, the AI could react to something super quickly to like grab a claim from the market, right? Or grab this geotherm here, or like we would put in timers where like like they found their headquarters and they shouldn't just like grab 4 spots on the map like immediately, right? Like you have to, whatever, right? Like you have to think about the player experience.
Yeah. Simon Thompson asks, do you prefer the pressure of real-time games with quick failure conditions like Offworld Trading Company, or slower, more considered, but potentially more drawn-out failure conditions like Civ 4?
I think if you're going to fail, the faster you fail, the better, right? And I mean, that is one thing I think was kind of a strength of Offworld, is that in the standard game, like when you lose, like you lose like that, right? Like it's just over. And like I thought, to me, that was like an improvement over I always thought of it as an RTS, right? Like, so to me, like most RTS games have this like last 5-minute problem where it's like it's just a bad, painful experience, right? Because the game is going to be over. The game is essentially over. It's just you have to do whatever you have to kill the rest of the units, or get the command points or whatever to get victory. The game doesn't really build to like this crescendo, right? So in Offworld, like if someone beats you, like it's just over. And we've seen games of Offworld that have come down to the wire where both players are like 95%, 96, 90, like that close to being able to buy the other one out. And one of them gets there like just a couple seconds before the other one too. Sometimes you'll see where people are playing on streams and they both get to 100% at the same time. And then it's like literally like who can press the button first, right? Which is absolutely not an experience you see in any other RTS game, right? And so like I definitely like that. And I think that there's a lot of problems in 4X games that you can't really solve. You can only mitigate, right? And I think that like I don't necessarily think there's like a great instant fail. The other thing is like the longer a game is, the more careful you have to be about losses, right? Lots of things are much more acceptable if a game is less than 30 minutes than if you're talking about a 10-hour experience. So like
yeah. A question here. You sort of touched on some of your solutions to this, but I know it's a topic that's close to your heart, because I remember a podcast between you and John Schaefer about this, which was super fascinating. Kevin writes, Dear CNC, my question concerns the mid-game crawl. Generally, 4X games have excellent openings. The world is there to be explored, with new surprises lurk around every corner. But more recently, many 4X games have succeeded in creating interesting end games, which were always the worst, through events, see Total Warhammer, Three Kingdoms, or Stellaris. I have no idea about Old World's end game. I have faith. but I'm more interested in how Soren and his team have dealt with the dreaded mid-game slog. See Stellaris, most of all, though Warhammer has this to a lesser degree. You've explored everything and had your first war, but now what? Rinse and repeat until an endgame event triggers something interesting, or even worse, there is no endgame and you just snowball till you see game over. Thanks for the fantastic pods, Kevin.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is something this is why we're in early access. Like, I'm still thinking through these issues right now. I think we have a lot of mechanics I'm happy with, right? And I think like we have reasonably good pacing right now because the game is not too long. We're not stuck with, I talked about earlier, we have to hit all these eras, so we can kind of decide how long we want the game to be. We have lots of different dials. We can move the victory points down, we can move them up, we can change how hard the ambitions are. But like, is the game still fun during, in turns, like 60 to 80, or 60 to 120 roughly. I will say one thing is that I think that having the tribes on the map helps us out some, because the game shifts kind of like a third of the way in, where early on your conflict is going to be with the tribes that surround you, because you're going to have to basically fight them. There's a couple ways to settle peacefully, but generally speaking, like, you're going to have to fight your way to capture the city sites, and that's a different style of combat. That's more like fighting zombies, basically. Like, they don't really have AI per se, right? They just kind of like come at you. They have different behaviors, but and then at some point you're gonna have to get into conflict with like a real civilization, and so then that feels significantly different, right? So I hope that fixes, it improves the pacing some. I think having the ambitions theoretically helps in that you have different things to aim for, right? And it gives you a reason to try something that you want. Like, we've heard reports of someone like, you're in a war with a civ, and you might want to have it end peacefully, but then there's an event that comes up where one of your families is like incensed at the Romans, and they demand vengeance, and so if you want to, you can opt into this ambition where you need to capture 3 Roman cities, right? And so now it's like you have this moment now where you're like, okay, normally I would go this way, now the game is giving me this option to go this other way if I want to, right? And my hope is I just want to keep creating more moments like that.
Yeah, that's cool. All right. I think that's all the old world questions that we have time for. So I know you have a deadline, Soren. So
Sure.
We'll let you go. Thank you so much for coming on. This is super
thanks
interesting.
so much, Soren.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. I definitely appreciate it. I enjoy you guys' podcast. You guys have been out for a long time, and it's great to be on.
Awesome.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Hello, Marsh here. I'm editing the podcast. This is the point at which Alex and Tom turned off the recording, but the conversation continued and was captured on Soren's end. It ended up being too entertaining not to use, thanks to the contributions of Leyla Johnson, who is Mohawk Games president and a writer and designer on Old World. Alex and Tom's sound quality takes a nosedive, but who wants to hear them anyway? And so, over to Soren and Leyla.
All right.
How's the launch been for you, Soren? Are you kind of juggling the isolation stuff?
Yeah, we're finished up there. They're saving it.
That been okay?
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, we've got a lot of people playing it, and it's selling well on the Epic Store, which we were curious about how that would work out. And yeah, we see that we've got like concurrent users. There's like 1,000 people playing it, and seeing a lot of streams, and we'll see how it pans out over the summer. But it's great to see genuine feedback. Great to see people playing the game who have no idea we're watching. Right, like that's that's super valuable. I mean, I don't know. It's so much harder to design a game if we decided not to go down that path. So it's been pretty cool.
Yeah. I assume you're having you can be on Steam in like a year's time, and I have friends in that situation, and they've sort of treated their Epic launch as like almost a soft launch. They don't really yell about it as much as they otherwise would, because they kind of want their big spike to be when it's on Steam.
Yeah, that's right. By the way, Layla's here if you want to say hi, Layla.
I can hear you. Hey, I can hear you now.
Yeah. You remember Tom, right? From GDC? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And
Thanks for your question.
The audible. But yeah, like we're kind of looking at it as a, it's a nice place to be on early access. Like we're not stuck with like Steam reviews and basic general Steam drama. Like it's, I don't know if Epic did this on purpose, but it sure works well for us.
Yeah, it's kind of a safe launch in a way.
Yep.
Yeah, but 1,000 concurrents is good.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we'll see if it continues like that, but I mean, we never got that for Offworld, at least not until we went free. I mean, in our Discord server, which we started, 2 weeks ago? When did you start it?
Started it 2 weeks ago, yeah.
It's already like 50% bigger than our Offworld server, which has been going for 5 years. So, so yeah, the signs are looking good. So yeah, we're pretty happy.
If you ever want to ask Soren difficult questions, just send me an email first.
Know all his weaknesses.
Yeah, we argue a lot in the kitchen about design ideas.
Yep. The kids hear all about it.
Yeah, I heard Soren talk about like the weirdest or I think it was the most difficult AI decisions he makes, and I was gonna mention yesterday night. This morning I woke up, came down and saw Soren with a face. Like Soren has a face when he's frustrated. He's just like generally peaceful. It almost like happens once or twice a year. So just so you could understand that it has a thing. It's a face. And I saw it and I was like, what's going on? It's like, I'm having a day. And it was 8:30. 8:30 in the morning.
It's a bad start.
And I'm like, okay, I generally just go for the coffee machine. And I was like, okay, just tell me what's going on. And it's like, there's this bug. And the thing is, it was because of something I triggered. So I was like, I wanted to start apologizing for creating this mess. But I generally support my ideas and I stand by them until they prove that, by the testers that it's a bad idea. And we're both very stubborn. So he goes, no, it's just more like I am pushing for...
She wanted polygamy.
I want polygamy. For a very, very historical reason. Like I write the events and I am writing now a series of events for each civilization, and I'm writing about Queen Olympias. And Queen Olympias actually was very furious with Philip for marrying a Macedonian and creating an heir who is pure Macedonian. She wasn't Macedonian. But her main anger with him was because he married other women. So I want to be able to translate that into mechanics. And if I cannot make Philip polygamous, I won't be able to create that series of, I think, great experience for players. And I can't do it with Nebuchadnezzar. I cannot do it with anyone else, who actually married more than one woman. And the drama, for people who like drama, can you imagine?
Yep.
So I made him start working on the AI that creates that for me, and that gave him the face.
Well, I had kind of did the first pass last night where like, okay, because, if you assume there's only one spouse, I'm sure, Tom, you can imagine like all the assumptions built into your code that like assume one spouse. So I had to like pull all of that out. And I was like, in the morning, I was like, well, let's give it a try. And then, I just passed turn after turn after turn, and no one was asking I got no marriage proposals, and I'm like, well, I guess I totally messed it up.
And then you fixed it.
The
because
problem,
you realized you just write your code so you complicate the code a little bit.
Well, it was actually someone else's change, which is actually the harder part.
Oh, yeah,
someone else added this bug that just broke every event. And so
we forgive him because he almost never makes a mistake.
Yeah, so I was looking in the wrong place, which is like that's a very hard thing to do when you're trying to fix a bug. So
it's fun. I asked about a religion for these reasons. Soren and I go on and on talking about stuff at home, And he wanted to create a type of religion earlier that's kind of closer to what he's used to. And I think that we started generating, because of Cyrus the Great, I told him, look, Cyrus was able to rule a nation with him being open to having multiple religion under his rule. Just go with the simplest way to create mechanics that match history. And that led slowly to us creating whatever we're creating now, but we are still not solidifying where we are in religion.
Yep. So,
yeah, slowly working towards it.
12 months to go, so...
I am working my way to castration and incest, you guys.
Yeah. For
a whole different podcast.
Yeah, for the record, I'm pro-castration and anti-incest, but we'll see where we end up.
Oh man, we should have you both on the podcast.
Yeah.
Well, you can have us back in a year, and you'll see where we ended up on all those juicy questions.
There are some things that you can. There are some things you can say when no one's recording, and that's just fun. It's just a conversation.
Yep.
That's why we secretly record this part.
Well, if you recorded it and it's there and you want to add it, it's okay.
Sadly, we don't.
Well, actually, I am recording it, actually, although you guys are probably
you are? Oh my god.
He does this all the time. He records it on his end because with Designer Notes, when he does the podcast for Designer Notes, I think at some point he had a bad experience with audio, so now he just makes sure that he is having a backup.
Yep.
Yeah, I think literally all of us have been a journalist and had this problem, right?
Yep.
I am also a journalist, by the way. That's what I studied.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought all of you there are journalists. Okay.
Yeah. Well, there's a pretty well-worn path now from journalism to developer, actually. So
I'm loving this world. I mean, I did journalism. I had a radio show, and then I worked for the State Department, and now I am working in the game industry, and it's not gonna go back. That's it. I'm here to stay.
Soren Johnson, what a lovely guy.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can check out Old World on the Epic Game Store, and it's at the very start of a year of development and content updates, which is exciting. So have a look at that. So it's the end of the show. You can hang out with us and our community on our Discord channel, our lovely community. You can find the address for signing up to that on our website, which is crateandcrowbar.com. If you have a question for a future episode, you can send it to us at questions@crateandcrowbar.com. You can tweet your questions to us at crateandcrowbar. That's an and, not an ampersand. You can listen to the pod if you don't already, or are not at this very moment, on YouTube. That's all the things about the questions and the places. The Crate and Crowbar is kindly funded by our Patreon backers. Thank you so much to all of you. You make this all possible. If you would like to know more about supporting our podcast and its spin-offs, visit patreon.com/Crate and Crowbar. I have been Alex Wiltshire. You can find me on Twitter at Rotational, which I'm not going to bother to spell tonight. And Tom.
I am on Twitter at Pentadact, Pentadact.
Great. Wow. Thanks.
Thanks
for listening.
Everybody.
Everybody.
A confident, bold exit there.